There is a specific kind of humiliation that burns hotter than a campfire coal, and for me, that moment wasn't when I lost my corporate career, or even when the divorce papers were finalized. No, it was 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, standing in my boxer shorts while the president of the Oakwood Shores Homeowners Association directed two confused sheriff's deputies to arrest me for sleeping on my own property. I can still smell it, that mix of pine needles, morning dew, and the overpowering perfume of Karen Sterling, a woman who treats the local bylaws like the Ten Commandments and wields her iPad like a judge's gavel. She was standing there in her pristine white jogging suit, tapping her acrylic nails against the screen, looking at my grandfather's canvas tent with the kind of disgust usually reserved for toxic waste, while her loyal sidekick Diane nodded along like a bobblehead doll. "That's him, officers," Karen shrilled, her voice cutting through the morning silence like a rusty saw. "Illegal encampment. Disturbing the peace. Driving down property values. Get him out of here." I tried to explain. I really did, holding my deed with shaking hands while the deputies, who honestly looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, glanced between the angry woman and the tired guy in his underwear. And even though Deputy Harrison was apologetic, saying they had to respond to the complaint, the optics were brutal because half the residents of Oakwood Shores were out on their mahogany decks sipping artisanal coffee, watching me pack up my life like a circus act leaving town. As I threw my sleeping bag into my truck, Karen delivered the line that would eventually seal her fate. She leaned in, smirking, and whispered, "Maybe next time you'll respect our community standards, Mr. Miller." And I drove away with my blood boiling, not knowing that she had just started a war she was absolutely going to lose. Let me rewind for a second so you understand the stakes here. My name is Jack, and this land, these 47 acres of untouched timber and shoreline, isn't just an asset. It's my sanctuary, inherited from my grandfather Arthur Miller, a Korean War vet who bought this place back in the 50s with nothing but his service pay and a dream of silence. He taught me everything here: how to fish off the limestone rocks, how to read the weather in the clouds, and how to build a fire that lasts all night. So after my life fell apart last year, this place became my therapy, my escape from a world that felt like it was crushing me. The property sits right next to Oakwood Shores, a development that popped up in the mid-2000s, filled with multi-million-dollar McMansions and people who obsess over lawn stripes. And for years we coexisted. I stayed in the woods. They stayed in their air conditioning, until Karen Sterling took over the board. She's the type of person who measures grass height with a ruler and issues fines if your mailbox is a slightly different shade of beige. So I should have known she'd eventually turn her gaze toward my little slice of heaven. I spent that Sunday fuming in my woodshop, running a piece of maple through the planer just to hear the noise, when the certified letter arrived. A formal notice from the county code enforcement citing me for operating an unpermitted commercial campground, with a threat of $500 daily fines. A move so calculated, so petty, it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. $500 a day for sleeping on land my family has paid taxes on for 70 years, land that Arthur walked every inch of. And that injustice lit a fire in my belly that no amount of meditation was going to extinguish. I drove straight to the county courthouse, that old brick building that smells like floor wax and despair, and descended into the basement records room, a tomb of fluorescent lights and dust where I met Martha, the clerk who has been there since the dawn of time. When I mentioned my grandfather, her eyes lit up because apparently Arthur Miller was a legend in county surveying, known for being as precise as a Swiss watch. And she pulled out the original 1919 survey map, the paper brittle and yellow, crackling as we smoothed it out over the metal table. We started overlaying the modern county maps with the historical deeds, tracing the lines with our fingers, and that's when the room stopped spinning and everything clicked into focus, because there was a faded red line on the old map that extended way further east than the current fence line. Martha adjusted her glasses, squinted, and whispered, "Honey, looks like when they subdivided for Oakwood Shores back in 2007, someone made a colossal mistake, or maybe they just hoped nobody would notice." My hands were shaking as I realized what I was looking at, because sitting right there on top of my legal property wasn't just grass. It was the Oakwood Shores private beach, their exclusive gazebo, and their concrete boat launch, totaling nearly 2.5 acres of prime waterfront real estate that they had been treating as their crown jewel for 15 years. They weren't just trespassing. They had built their entire community identity on land that belonged to Jack Miller. Now, you might be thinking about adverse possession, that legal loophole where squatters can steal your land if they use it long enough, usually 7 to 20 years. But Martha pointed out the kicker with a sly grin, because my grandfather, being the meticulous genius he was, had filed a secondary survey in the late 80s that re-verified the markers, resetting the clock. And since I had receipts and photos of us using the land every single summer, their claim to exclusive use was dead in the water. I walked out of that courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun, clutching a roll of photocopies that was basically a nuclear launch code. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the hunter. That night, the gravel crunching under my tires sounded different. It sounded like justice. And I called up George Henderson, a retired surveyor who actually lived in Oakwood Shores but hated the politics. And when I told him what I found, there was a long silence on the line before he said, "Jack, if you're right, this isn't just a boundary dispute. This is an extinction event for the HOA." 2 days later, the escalation began. Karen sent a cease and desist from a fancy law firm, threatening to sue me for intentional interference and harassment, proving she had no idea what was coming. And she called an emergency community meeting for Thursday night to rally the troops against the homeless intruder. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I walked into that clubhouse anyway, the air thick with the smell of stale donuts and expensive perfume, finding 40 angry residents listening to Karen give a PowerPoint presentation titled "Protecting Our Investment," featuring photos of my tent circled in red like a crime scene. She was in her element, preaching about how I was trying to extort them, demanding an $8,000 special assessment from every household to fund a legal war against me, whipping the crowd into a frenzy of fear until I stood up in the back, my boots heavy on the carpet, and said, "Excuse me, I'm not here to take your money. I'm here to tell you that you're sitting on my land." I dropped the stack of documents on the table with a heavy thud, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and watched as George Henderson stood up from the third row, walked over, and began to read, the room falling into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the refrigerator. George looked up, adjusted his spectacles, and said to the room, "These look legitimate, and if they are, we don't own the beach, the gazebo, or the boat launch. Jack does." The color drained from Karen's face so fast I thought she was going to faint, her white suit suddenly looking like a surrender flag, but she snapped back, sputtering that it was all lies, fabricated nonsense. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Neighbors started whispering, looking at each other with fear, and as I walked out, 3 residents, the Kellys and an older gentleman named Mr. Thompson, quietly approached me in the parking lot to say they didn't trust Karen and wanted to know the truth. I drove home that night knowing the battle had just begun. The community was fracturing, lines were being drawn, and Karen Sterling was about to learn that you never, ever wake a sleeping giant, especially one with a 1919 land survey and nothing left to lose. If I thought Karen Sterling was going to look at the undeniable proof of my property rights and apologize, I was dead wrong. Instead, she went full scorched earth, launching a retaliation campaign so petty and vicious it would have impressed a cartel boss. Within a week, she had weaponized every bureaucratic arm of the city against me, reporting me to the IRS for unreported rental income from my imaginary campground and convincing the zoning board to send an inspector who looked like he'd been briefed to find a violation even if he had to invent one. I'm sitting there by my fire pit, trying to enjoy a cup of coffee, when this guy in a hard hat waltzes in and hands me a citation for improperly installed tent stakes, threatening a daily fine that would bankrupt me in a month, and I knew right then that Karen wasn't just protecting the neighborhood, she was trying to erase me. She even went after my livelihood, orchestrating a review bombing campaign on my custom woodworking business, flooding my Google page with 1-star reviews from people who had never bought a chair in their lives, calling me unstable and a thief, and I watched as 3 major clients canceled their orders in a single afternoon. But while she was playing dirty in the mud, I was preparing for a surgical strike, and that Saturday, George Henderson showed up at my property line with the Kellys in tow, carrying a GPS surveying rig that looked like a piece of alien technology and cost more than my truck. "Jack," he said, patting the yellow tripod, "let's settle this with science." And we spent the next 6 hours hacking through the brush, the GPS unit chirping every time it locked onto a satellite, confirming marker after marker with terrifying precision. When we finally plotted the coordinates, the reality was even worse than the map suggested. Not only did I own the beach and the gazebo, but the property line actually cut through a corner of the community clubhouse, meaning Oakwood Shores was encroaching on 2.7 acres of my land. But then George found the smoking gun. Buried deep in the deed was a perpetual easement clause, meaning my family had a permanent, unbreakable legal right to cross their land to get to the water, regardless of who owned what, a legal superpower that basically made me untouchable. Susan Kelly, who had been taking notes, looked up with wide eyes and dropped a bomb of her own, whispering, "You know, back in 2019, at a board meeting, Karen mentioned a property line discrepancy, but told us it was resolved and too expensive to resurvey." She knew. Jack, she's known for years. This wasn't just an accident anymore. It was a cover-up, a conspiracy of silence to protect property values at the expense of the truth. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from a burner number saying, "Drop this or you'll regret it." But I just smiled, because Elena Ross, a pro bono attorney who heard about my case and smelled blood in the water, was sitting at my kitchen table laying out a legal strategy that was less of a lawsuit and more of an execution. "We have them on trespassing. We have them on harassment," Elena said, her voice cool and deadly. "But we need to find out why Karen is fighting so hard, because people don't risk prison just to save a gazebo." That's when the second twist hit us like a freight train. Susan Kelly had been secretly recording HOA meetings for months because she didn't trust the board, and she played us a clip from a closed-door session where Karen admitted that the HOA had borrowed $340,000 to renovate the clubhouse, using the waterfront land, my land, as collateral for the bank loan. The room went dead silent as the implications sank in. They had committed mortgage fraud, pledging property they didn't own to secure a massive loan, and if the bank found out, the loan would be called in immediately, bankrupting the entire association. But it got deeper because Rick Kelly did some digging and found out the original developer of Oakwood Shores was none other than Karen's brother-in-law, a guy who declared bankruptcy 2 years ago and vanished, meaning the entire development was built on a foundation of nepotism and lies. George's wife, a retired forensic accountant, volunteered to look at the HOA books, and what she found made my stomach turn. Karen hadn't just been covering up the land issue. She had been siphoning money, roughly $73,000 over 4 years, hiding it under consulting fees and landscaping overages that went straight into her pocket. The realization hit me that this wasn't David versus Goliath anymore. This was David versus a criminal enterprise led by a woman who was gambling with 47 families' financial futures just to keep her BMW payments current. Karen wasn't protecting the community. She was holding them hostage, because if the truth came out, the insurance wouldn't cover the fraud, and every single homeowner would be personally liable for the debt, facing assessments of up to $25,000 each. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't just left me some trees and water. He had left me the key to freeing an entire neighborhood from a tyrant. I installed security cameras around my perimeter, and sure enough, they caught Karen herself at 2 a.m., looking deranged, spray-painting the word fraud on my fence, a poetic irony that was almost too perfect. The tension in the air was electric. You could feel it when you drove past the subdivision. Neighbors were choosing sides, shouting matches were breaking out in driveways, and Karen was spiraling, holding secret meetings, hiring a private investigator with HOA funds to stalk me, desperate to find dirt that didn't exist. She was cornered, dangerous, and willing to burn the whole village down to save herself. But she didn't know that we were gathering the kindling for a bonfire of our own. We drafted a settlement offer, a way out, offering a permanent easement for $150,000, a fraction of what they owed me in back rent, plus Karen's immediate resignation and a full admission of the fraud. It was generous, it was merciful, and when Karen received it, she didn't just reject it. She declared war, filing a countersuit against me for emotional distress and launching a fundraising campaign to save our homes, unaware that she was marching her followers straight off a cliff. The final showdown didn't happen in a courtroom, but in the fluorescent-lit purgatory of the city council chambers, packed so tight with sweating bodies that the air conditioning had given up the ghost. Karen Sterling had rallied her dwindling army of 18 loyalists, people so terrified of losing their property value that they chose to believe the lie, sitting in the front row with their arms crossed, glaring at me like I was the devil himself. But the tide was turning. Behind me sat George, the Kellys, Mr. Thompson, and a growing crowd of residents who had seen the evidence, seen the security footage of Karen vandalizing my fence, and realized that their leader was the one holding the match. The mayor called the meeting to order, the tension so thick you could taste the ozone, and Karen took the podium first, putting on a performance worthy of an Academy Award, crying real tears as she clicked through slides of children playing on the beach, painting me as a greedy predator destroying the American dream. This man, she sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at me, is exploiting a clerical error to rob hard-working families. And for a moment, the room swayed, the emotional manipulation landing perfectly, until it was my turn. I walked up, placed George's certified GPS survey on the table, and said quietly, "I don't want your homes, I never did. I offered you a settlement 3 months ago to keep your beach, and Ms. Sterling hid it from you because she couldn't afford to let you see the truth." That's when Elena Ross stepped up and dropped the hammer, projecting the bank records on the big screen, the unauthorized withdrawals, the fake invoices, the $73,000 explicitly traced to Karen's personal accounts. The room erupted, a collective gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the chamber, followed by the shouting of 40 angry homeowners realizing they had been robbed by the woman sitting next to them. Karen jumped up, screaming that it was fake, that it was a conspiracy, her face twisting into a mask of pure panic. But then Susan Kelly walked to the mic and played the audio recording from 2019, Karen's own voice echoing through the speakers. "It's cheaper to fight than to fix it. Just bury the survey." The silence that followed was heavy, total, and absolute. And then, in a moment that felt scripted by Hollywood but was purely, deliciously real, the district attorney's investigator stood up from the back of the room, walked down the aisle, and placed a hand on Karen's shoulder. "Patricia Karen Sterling," he said, loud enough for the cameras to catch, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, grand larceny, and fraud." And the sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest noise in the world. Her supporters sat there, stunned, watching their leader get marched out past the very people she had stolen from. And George Henderson stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "On behalf of the board, we accept Mr. Miller's settlement offer." The applause started slowly, then built into a roar, a release of months of fear and anger. And as the mayor banged his gavel, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't realized I was carrying since that first morning in my boxer shorts. 6 months later, the mist is rising off Mirror Lake again, but the vibe is different now. I'm sitting by the fire pit, but I'm not alone. George is down on the dock teaching his grandson to fish. Susan is grilling burgers on the new communal barbecue, and the fence between my land and Oakwood Shores is gone, replaced by a simple path. Karen pleaded guilty and is currently serving 18 months plus probation, having to pay back every cent she stole, and the new board, led by Susan, is running things with transparency and honesty. The $150,000 settlement allowed me to expand my shop and start a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name for veterans' kids, turning a legacy of conflict into one of opportunity. We even turned 20 acres into a permanent conservation easement, so no developer can ever touch it again, ensuring that Arthur Miller's woods stay wild forever. The hate, the lawsuits, the slashed tires, it all faded away, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and the sound of neighbors actually being neighbors. It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? How many people are out there right now, terrified of a bully in a blazer, accepting injustice just to keep the peace? Sometimes the peace is just a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the fight. But as my grandfather used to say, the land doesn't lie, and neither should we. If you've ever had to stand your ground when the whole world told you to move, drop a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if you enjoyed watching a tyrant get exactly what she deserved, hit that subscribe button, because next week, I'm telling you about the time a neighbor tried to claim my driveway and ended up owing me 50 grand. Until then, keep your powder dry and your boundaries clear.